Thank you for inviting me here today. Thanks to John Adams Institute for organizing this event. I'm glad the Dutch are accepting both refugees and exiles, which I am, as you can guess. Also, I feel here closer to home than from New York, where I live, when I hear that every speaker, profoundly says Kasparov, which is a Russian pronunciation, while Americans always say Kasparov. I understand that, for many of you, I am still best known for chess, which has the Dutch defense, than for politics, where I'm more concerned about the lack of Dutch offense. I was told by a young woman listener yesterday at a smaller event that, quote, "Your message is depressing, Mr. Kasparov, but I'm not depressed because of how you said it." I will take that to heart here today. I don't want to scare or depress anyone. The book is called Winter is Coming, but please don't blame the weatherman for a dark forecast. I hope to share my analysis and my experiences and my opinions, and your reaction is entirely up to you. I'd like to begin with an interesting anniversary before moving on to the book and to current events in Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. It's an example that reflects a little of how I like to see the world. A year ago, today, on December 12, 2014, the price of a barrel of oil dropped below $60 a barrel for the first time in 5 years. For the most of the industrialized world, this was good news, promising cheaper fuel. I wrote at the time that while celebrating, we should also be very cautious on the international front. Many of the world's most repressive regimes depend on high energy prices to maintain internal stability, including Putin's Russia. With oil dropping so low, these dictators would need to find other ways to justify the eternal grip on power and the typical recipe: foreign aggression. Putin had already spent most of that year invading eastern Ukraine, but I wrote he will soon need a new front. Contrary to Putin's expectations, the Ukrainians had fought very hard, and if he continued there, the price in Russian lives lost there would get too high. The Baltics, another possible direction of his attack, would be even riskier because NATO had already begun preparations there. So I was thinking south, to the Caucasus. And Putin did go south, but even further, all the way to Syria. It should not have been such a surprise, since the Middle East has so many of the ingredients Putin is always interested in: gas, oil, key pipelines. Second, the Russian naval base to quote-unquote protect from outside enemies. Third, Syria has a messy border situation with a NATO country, Turkey. And NATO is the only enemy big enough to satisfy Putin's propaganda in case of total economic collapse in Russia. And last but not least, a growing refugee crisis that would strengthen Putin's main allies in Europe, the ultranationalists. The way things have gone in the Middle East are an excellent case study of many of the themes in my book about the nature of dictatorships and their relative advantages and disadvantages when matched against the free world. The impossible mix of rivalries and alliances in the region, and how the violence there has spilled over into the rest of the world, is also illustrative of conflict and power politics in the post-Cold War world. To deal with this crisis, we must think deeply and we must think strategically. We must plan for the long term and build lasting institutions instead of running around in a panic, demanding an immediate response to every item in the morning news. My book is titled Winter is Coming, and I assure you this is not merely a homage to the great series of books and television shows Game of Thrones. The title reflects the idea that there are cyclical patterns in history, or seasons. Of course, this is more of a poetic metaphor than a political science theory, but it does provide a useful framework to examine the back and forth, action-reaction character of world events, and especially foreign policy. The dark winter of the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The thawing of spring with European unification and the summer of blue skies, albeit with a few dark clouds in the Balkans and Africa. But the existential threat we had lived with for decades was over. Hundreds of millions of people have been freed from totalitarian communism. It was time to celebrate. In this regard, my book's title is a sort of long-delayed response to the title of another book, Francis Fukuyama's famous The End of History from 1992. To simplify greatly, he saw the fall of the USSR as a victory in the last great battle for the development of human society, the triumph of capitalism and liberal democracy, the forces of light winning over the forces of darkness. I spoke with Professor Fukuyama last year, and I was delighted when he agreed to contribute a blurb for my book. After 23 years since the end of history, he agrees that history is making a dangerous comeback. But I cannot criticize his hopeful 1992 vision simply because I shared it myself. From the other side of that fallen wall, I had long dreamed of that day and whenever possible done my small part to bring it closer. Unfortunately, history does not end, and the evil does not die. It may be battled back, cut down like a weed, but it grows back in the cracks of our complacency. That growth is one of the stories in Winter is Coming. The first story is the rise and fall of Russian democracy from Gorbachev's retreat from Europe to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. How did we go from the jubilant crowds in Moscow tearing down the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the KGB, to just 9 years later electing a former KGB lieutenant colonel as the president? The second element is my personal story as a witness and sometimes participant in the events. From a rebellious young chess champion in the USSR to a rebellious old chess champion in Russia. And to my current activities as the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation based in New York, with activities supporting individual freedom and dissidents from North Korea to Venezuela. The third story in the book is what the rest of the world did and did not do, as Russia and other former Soviet nations failed to embrace democracy. It's a story of how the free world failed to press its huge advantage over its enemies after the Iron Curtain fell. This complacency allowed dictatorships to slowly grow powerful and the force of terror to prepare an attack. By the way, I'm aware that terms like free world and even enemies can sound old-fashioned to some. But enemies don't care what vocabulary you use to describe them. Enemies try to kill you, to terrorize you, to undermine your institutions and your way of life. Enemies hate you no matter how much you try to engage with them or how often insist you are not at war with them. Pretending our enemies do not exist or finding new euphemisms to describe them will not stop them or make us safer. Let us not fall into the propaganda habits of dictatorships. Let us end the culture of denial and call things by their correct names. Now there are once again enemies not only at the gates, but inside the gates. And after 25 years of complacency, Europe is culturally, militarily, and rhetorically unprepared to fight them off. The beloved European soft power tools of economic and political engagement do not deter or weaken an aggressive dictator like Vladimir Putin. They encourage him. The openness and charity that represent the great European Union experiment at its best also make it all the more vulnerable to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the disruptive impact of immigrant groups that do not return that openness, or in fact resent it. During the Cold War, the security focus of the European Union and nearly all of its members was external. The Soviet Union was a tangible threat, with an oppressive grip of half the continent, an aggressive ideology, and a massive military and nuclear arsenal. The existence of an obvious enemy reduced security matters to a simple binary for the EU and for the European nations without complicated colonial legacies. The United States, often via NATO, set the agenda and spent untold fortunes on defense buildup to keep the USSR in check for decades. An immune system that rarely comes into contact with pathogens never gets strong enough to fight off dangerous diseases on its own. Many Europeans resent it and are loath to admit it still, but for decades, the United States has functioned as a sort of antiseptic for Europe and much of Asia, protecting it from threats with the side effect of allowing Europe's own immune system to atrophy. But the US has been steadily retreating from the world under President Barack Obama, who has overfulfilled his mandate to be the anti-George W. Bush, that Americans and most Europeans felt was needed after years of painful and costly engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. Obama's policy of American retreat and retrenchment has been in its way as extreme as W. Bush's intervention policy was, with secure consequences no less dire. This is especially true in Europe, which has been unable to respond coherently or cohesively while facing so many threats. The weakness of Europe's defense institutions has been rudely exposed. If the grand experiment of Europe is to survive, it must adapt to face the new challenges. Waiting and quietly hoping that the next US president will come riding to the rescue on a white horse only perpetuates the conditions of willful helplessness. Plus, Obama still has 13 months in office, a span that looks to become increasingly perilous. So what is to be done? Everyone asked for solutions as if we're here to solve a chess problem. But we cannot fall victim to the solutions now trap that leads us away from strategic thinking. To use some chess terminology, dictatorships have an advantage when it comes to rapid tactical maneuvers. There is no parliamentary authorization necessary, no poll numbers to worry about, no critical media. Dictators cannot worry about long-term consequences, only looking strong and staying in power today. The one thing they know is that they cannot afford to look weak or get distracted by planning too far ahead, or their subordinates might begin to wonder if it's time for a change on the top. Even the most long-lived dictators rarely look beyond tomorrow's battles. It's hard to look into the future when you are always looking over your shoulder. Putin, for example, may well be in the quagmires in both Ukraine and Syria, but he cannot slow down at all. He needs even more action, more conflict, and more mud in the water instead of posing to clean up his messes. Democracy, in contrast, can be very slow to act tactically due to their layers of political alliances, public and governmental accountability, and systemic checks and balances, not to mention the cautious evaluation of public opinion. The strength of the free world is strategic, not tactical. Common goals, political and economic stability, and strong institutions allow for long-term planning and continuity. We have the ability to build frameworks to solve problems and meet challenges, albeit bureaucratically. When our institutions are weakened or outdated, we cease to play strategically and are drawn into the dictator's preferred battleground of tactical chaos. This is what we're seeing today, with confused responses to Putin's aggression and to the civil war in Syria and the resulting waves of refugees. The European Union is a wonderful example of a successful modern institution that promotes democracy and free markets, but it was never intended to be a military alliance. We must build institutions capable of fighting this new war against democracy and the world order, or that order will not last much longer. This is not a new Cold War. It's a shooting war for Europe already, with massive casualties from the streets of Paris to the skies above Ukraine. This is a war against modernity by forces that want to turn back the clock. You're already fighting it, whether you admit it or not. And you are on the front lines until you take the fight to the enemy at the source. The John Adams Institute reflects the centuries of collaboration between Europe and the United States, and that collaboration must be reborn today. Allies must share values, not just borders and common interests. It is repulsive to suggest an alliance with Putin's Russia and Iran, both sponsors of terror and the murderous Bashar al-Assad's regime. Their regimes are based on hate and repression and violence and nothing else. The free world can no sooner ally with such regimes than a patient can ally with the cancer that is eating at his bones. All across Europe, there are voices calling to lift sanctions against Russia, despite the continued occupation and annexation of European territory that was taken by brute force. Do you negotiate with a cannibal by serving him pieces of your body or of your neighbor's body? Do you think Putin will stop on his own and suffer the violent consequences nearly every brutal dictator suffers when he falls from power? No. My mother still lives in Moscow. She's 78, she was born under Stalin, and so has seen and heard every type of propaganda, as I'm sure you can imagine. She says, it's even worse today than before in the Soviet days, because there is not even an illusion of a better future. Of course, I have not a positive word to say about communism, but at least it attempted to present a positive image of the future, however wrong it was. Today is all darkness and hate. Russia is surrounded by enemies with only a mythological hero, the invincible, indispensable Putin, to defend it. Like most dictators, when he started, Putin needed friends, and he found many of them in the West. Now that he has completely wiped out any opposition inside of Russia, he needs foreign enemies, not friends. This means he will be increasingly dangerous until he's gone. There is no point of pretending he will be a friend if only you appease him enough. The free world has an overwhelming economic and military advantage today, as never before in history. It does not need Putin's help or Iran's help, unlike the alliance with Stalin to fight Hitler. We have the cause and we have the might. What is lacking is the will. Our new institutions must remember the lessons that won the Cold War. Engagement and attempts to find common ground with aggressive dictatorship will only undermine our cause. Globalization is a powerful tool for growth, but it also provides autocratic regimes with resources for repression. The United Nations was designed to avoid conflicts between superpowers, and today it has become a platform for dictatorships and many of the world's worst human rights offenders. Our new institutions must exclude the dictators, must isolate repressive regimes, and must act to protect our interests, our lives, and our values. I've been called a warmonger because I say that confronting evil is better than waiting until it grows stronger. Winter is coming is a story that the evil can grow until it threatens us all. As I wrote in 2006, Putin was then a Russian problem, who would become a regional problem, and then everyone's problem unless he was stopped. And Putin could have been stopped, or at least limited years ago, but he was encouraged to expand by receiving no resistance. Bashar al-Assad could have been ousted relatively easily 4 years ago, or even 2 years ago, and hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. But Europe and America didn't see why they should take risks or take real actions. Now the consequences are arriving in your cities. I desperately want to avoid greater war, but I read enough history books to learn that failing to stand up in small conflicts inevitably leads to big ones. History tells us that appeasement has caused far more deaths than deterrence. But deterrence is hard and appeasement is easy, like falling asleep in the snow. It is time to wake up. It's a fight is worth fighting, and if it's worth fighting, it is worth winning. Nearly every EU nation has been underpaying its minimum NATO requirement for defense spending for years. And of course that must change immediately. Europe needs a plan of action that addresses the causes of the security crisis, not just its symptoms. There must be unity against aggressors and public acknowledgement that military action abroad can be necessary for security at home. Winter is coming. Yes, but if we act, we can make it shorter and make the cold less bitter. Every day it will get more difficult and the price will go up. There are many steps to take, but the first and the most important is admitting there is a problem instead of hoping it will go away on its own. It will not. Europe must admit that there are some challenges that cannot be met with endless dialogue and bureaucracy. It is time to put down the pen and pick up the sword. 200 years ago, John Adams feared that Europe was abandoning America to its fate. He worked tirelessly, including here in Amsterdam, to bridge that gap, and in many ways he succeeded. Today it's America that is retreating behind its ocean walls, leaving Europe on the front line against Putin and against terror, and dealing with the refugees born of terror. Europe must both defend itself and must also call upon the United States today, much as Adams called on Europe 2 centuries ago. We should also remember the words of John Adams in a letter he wrote to his wife Abigail in 1777, but a letter he addressed very explicitly to history, and therefore to us here in this room today. Adams wrote, "Posterity, you will never know how much it costs the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. Let us not disappoint this great man. Let us make good use of our freedom and protect it. Thank you.
A very famous Russian saying from history is, "Что делать? What has to be done?"
And who is guilty?
And who is guilty? Кто виноват? What has to be done?
Well,
because you're talking about pick up the sword. In your book you write actually that Obama should have sent defensive weapons to Ukraine at the beginning of the war to really show Putin that we were serious about stopping his aggression. What actually could we do now to heat up the geopolitical climate?
Now, as a professional player, I used to analyze the moves we made before, just to understand mistakes that were made, and so what worked, what didn't work. So that's why I insist that we have to look back. Not to split the blame, because you repeated a few times that I was critical of Barack Obama. I was also critical about Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. So I'm not sparing words in criticizing people who I believe did something wrong in promoting freedom and defending our values. I think that we should recognize that since the end of the Cold War, there was no consistent policy offering the strategic vision for the future, and it was absolutely vital because it's when the history, it doesn't end, but when you are at the end of one chapter and you move into the new page, you have to come up with new ideas, and it was up to us, up to the winners of the Cold War, the free world, to offer this vision. Instead, there were many spontaneous moves, and U.S. foreign policy, for instance, moved like a pendulum. For Clinton doing little, George W. doing too much, Obama doing nothing. So it goes, as a pendulum, which created very chaotic events worldwide because nobody knows what to expect. You have a new president, and what will be his or her reaction. So during the Cold War, and that's why I emphasize in my presentation, the free world relied on institutions. And everybody knew that whether you have a Democrat or Republican in the White House, the Social Democrats or Conservatives in a European country, these policies could differ, but only within a range.
Were they replaced by business interest? For instance, Europe is a very huge investor in Russia nowadays? Oh,
absolutely. Look, business interest, always is very important, but, should we start, recalling, how many Western corporations, including Americans, did business with Nazi Germany? Are you aware that Hollywood, with, by the way, Jews as the heads of the main studios, has been selling movies to Nazi Germany until 1940? And even, it ended up at one point with Nazi general counsel in Los Angeles censoring the movies to make sure that they could make, just to the big screen because it was the biggest market. Now, I don't think that, we should let business to dictate the terms when it comes to the fight for our values. Yes. Ideally, I would love to see, and I believe it will happen eventually, Russia as a part of the family of civilized nations and the business relations that will be dominant in the future for Russia and for the rest of Europe. But right now, we're facing an imminent threat because, as I was explaining in the book, and I just mentioned briefly in my presentation, we are facing enemies of modernity, and we have no common ground because Europe enjoyed prosperity and peace for almost 7 decades because we had rules, we had international treaties, they were respected. And very much because of that, very much because we knew how to defend ourselves against these threats, we reached the point where we suddenly discovered that there are threats that we don't know how to deal with. And Putin needs conflict, and he will create new conflicts. And he has been encouraged over years by the lack of response, or very weak response, to his actions. And those who think that Crimea is far away because it's somewhere in Eastern Europe, or some say it's not even Europe at all because it's Ukraine, though of course it's Europe. They just, they ignore the fact that the world is getting smaller today because we all depend on each other. And Syria is even further away than Ukraine. But the consequence of war in Syria already being felt in Europe, and of course the very fact that Putin, at least for now, succeeded in annexing territory of another European country, nothing that happened in Europe since 1938, to be very precise, sends a wrong signal not only to Putin, but also to many others in the world, because they could see that the world is going back to the, I won't say dark ages, but to the 19th century, early 20th century, where the brute force was a decisive factor in international politics.
Do you think we didn't listen seriously to his words, for instance, when the West was talking about NATO enlargement with Ukraine?
I think this is absolutely, you're absolutely right. I think
there is this inferiority complex the Russian power elite is talking about. I can remember that during my years in Moscow, I never met a Russian official who felt inferior about the loss of the Soviet Empire.
But does it remind you of inferior complex of another elite in Europe 80 years ago? I mean, it's just, unfortunately, the language is too familiar. So it's this, Russia, preserved, more than anybody could expect after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Unlike, by the way, Germany after World War I, Russia was not punished. There were no reparations. To the contrary, there was a huge financial aid, both from the United States and European Union. And at the end of the day, again, that's the Russia preserved, it's the old nuclear arsenal and most of the Soviet properties worldwide. Now, for those who were complaining about Eastern European nations, joining NATO, I mean, I still think that we should remember we live in the 21st century. So are you going to tell Estonians or Latvians or Poles or now Ukrainians that they have no right to decide where they want to be? So whether they want to be in a NATO or in the European Union, and they will have to listen to the big boss in Moscow, deciding on their future? I think we should remember that, again, the prosperity and security is based on the mutual respect. And there are rules and regulations and treaties, by the way, signed by all Russian presidents regarding Ukraine, Yeltsin, Putin, and even Medvedev, and ratified by all Russian parliaments that accepted a new map, a new reality, geographical reality after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
In your book, you write about the help funds the West sent to Moscow after 1991. It were billions of dollars from Germany, from the US, etc., etc. So actually, as far as you're concerned, there's no reason for this feeling of humiliation.
Again, there are some, there's some phantom pains, and it's just you cannot do.
Course,
and it's you may call it post-operation syndrome, but it's still phantom. You can compare, Russia, in the 90s and Germany, Weimar Germany in the 20s, and you could see the huge difference. There was no humiliation. Russia was, kept a seat in the United Nations with the veto rights, and was given basically, a free ride in many occasions. In many cases where, by the way, America could act much tougher. For instance, when everybody talks about Iranian nuclear deal, I mean, very few remember that this issue was raised first time in 1995 by Bill Clinton, because that was the first year when Russia made a transfer of nuclear technology to Iran. And United States Congress passed a resolution making it conditional for Russia to stop these transactions in order to receive more financial aid. And Clinton decided against pushing it with Yeltsin. He just raised the issue and then walked away after Yeltsin's assurances that it's not a big deal. So we could see that there were many cases where U.S. administration could push Russia in the 90s, and they decided against doing it and embracing and bringing Russia in. And of course, there was a big advance to Yeltsin when Russia was invited to I always have a problem saying G8, because G7 stood for 7 great industrial democracies, and even under Yeltsin, Russia was not did not qualify completely, but it was an important step. So it was an invitation of Russian president to be at the table of the most powerful democratic leaders. Let's not forget China, which was much more powerful economically, was not invited. So, and trying to complain now about the humiliation in the 90s, it's like, like a delayed attempt to justify the aggressive policies of Putin's Russia and its total contempt to the law, both inside or outside of Russia.
Let's turn to the ordinary Russians. 𝐊𝐚𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐚𝐫, Alexeyevich, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, she wrote this marvelous book, Second Hand Time, de terugkeer van de rode mens in Dutch. She writes that she became so very depressed because so many ordinary Russians suddenly also felt this phantom pain after the seizure of the Crimea. Everybody around her was shouting, "Krim nash, Crimea is ours." How come? Is that, of course, the state propaganda plays a huge role in that, but how come that suddenly this huge part of the population felt this phantom pain and is now supporting?
Did you see a documentary of Germans celebrating the Anschluss of Austria or Sudetenland? It's again, if you don't understand the connections between these kind of actions, brazen actions of a dictator and future consequences, you will celebrate that because what's happening in Crimea was very important. That's why it's worked. It was without a single bullet fired. This is very important because it creates an illusion that you can move on. And by that time already Putin destroyed opposition inside Russia, so there was almost no alternative source of information. And also there was no immediate reaction, so basically, okay, why not? So if somebody offers you a piece of real estate for free, why not to grab it? So now, if you ask Russians a different question, so are you willing to pay? How much are you willing to pay for Crimea? So just this, and you start showing pictures of the future, about the sanctions and other consequences that I'm afraid is yet to come. I think that people will start calculating. It's not a free piece of real estate, but you have to start, paying with your jobs, with education of your kids. So it's very difficult to have a normal debate in a country like Russia when government controls the media. It's 100% control, and it could manipulate with public opinion. Again, especially with such explosive item as just recovering part of our lost territories.
Is it also are it remains from a kind of Soviet mentality among the older generation?
I don't think it's just older generation because you have many young people actually, and I would even say it's a much bigger problem because they grew up. When you look at those who are now in this, let's say about 40 or just in 30s now, they grew up in the Yeltsin's Russia, and they were just entering life when Putin took over, and they could see in the 90s problems. It is it's great instability, and at the same time they could watch television with old Soviet movies, and of course that's very very different picture of the quote unquote reality. So it's the older stories, the images of the past, they somehow made a huge impact on them, and on their philosophy. And also, this generation entered adult life where they could see a dramatic rise of Russian economy thanks to the very high oil prices. In 1998, the oil prices dropped below $10. In the next 9 years, it rose to nearly 150. So naturally, Putin had so much money that, Yeltsin's government couldn't spend on social programs and buying the loyalty, or I would say buying the apathy, social apathy of Russian population. So they could see that Putin is there's more money, so there are more opportunities for business, there's growing middle class, you can go to other countries. So for them it was, a demonstration of a new strength of Russia, and that's how Putin built an enormous credit of trust with many groups of Russians.
No bad word about the Tsar. The ministers are the crooks.
Yes, but it's also Putin kept repeating, and I think that was something that following your one of your remarks is that nobody wanted to hear it in the West. He kept repeating the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So I mean, for me, it was like a Freudian message. So just if given a chance, what he would do. And his first act as a Russian president was to restore Soviet anthem, which was also very symbolic and demonstrated where his sympathies, true sympathies, lied.
But at the same time, the cooperation between the Russian army and NATO high command were, in the first 10, 12 years, very good.
But there's no... Russia never had any threats from the West. I mean, it's for those who think otherwise, you can just look simple at the statistics. By 2013, there was no single American tank left in Europe. Not a single American tank. So it's just, yes, NATO moved to the borders, to Estonia, Latvia, but it was formality. I mean, there were no troops there. It was all like, psychological reassurance for Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, and others, who, by the way, have a pretty good historic genetic memory about what's happened, with them, under Soviet occupation, just to protect them. And thanks God, if not for NATO protection, do you have any doubts that Putin tanks will be today in Riga, Vilnius, and Tallinn?
So it means that actually the power elite in the Kremlin doesn't have any reason to feel surrounded by the enemy. Look, and NATO is a defensive organization. It's what you hear often in Holland.
Russia, oh yeah, absolutely. Especially from people who place their fortunes, send their kids, to abroad, bought palaces, jets, They're building their life outside of Russia, and at the same time complaining about the West being so aggressive and so unfriendly. It's Russia made trillions of dollars, just probably more than $2 trillion on selling oil and gas, natural resources. Most of this money was not invested in Russia. You can find the trace of this money all the way from Riga, I used to say to London, now all the way to Miami. So this money was embraced. The Russian oligarchs were embraced. They could, do whatever they wanted to buy soccer teams, basketball teams, yachts. And their families. I mean, even Putin's daughter lived in Holland. Maybe she still lives here. The eldest daughter. So she married a Dutchman. Yeah. At least that's what we know from the rumors, because it's quite amazing that Putin has 2 daughters, and maybe more, by the way. So this is, because the rumor after publishing the story that he had, a child from famous Russian gymnast champion, the paper was, closed in a week time. So, and it was, by the way, it was several years ago, not even today. So we don't have any, clear information about his private life. It's been protected, as a KGB secret. And recently, another story was popped in about his second daughter, married to a son of one of his closest buddies, who is of course a billionaire now. And this young family has a fortune of about a couple of $1 billion, and she is the deputy dean of Moscow University. And the Putin spokesperson refused to answer the question. He said he had no idea who this woman is, and it is not his job to respond to the private questions. I mean, can you imagine, just Obama's spokesperson, saying, I don't know, just, the names of these 2 girls, maybe they are Obama's daughters, maybe Michelle is wife, but I have no idea, just please, leave me alone.
What really was at stake for Putin when Maidan started? Was it the protecting of his own kleptocracy? Or was it really, I've got to defend this Russian-speaking people in the eastern Ukraine whose lives are threatened? We know Putin as a KGB, he isn't interested in human lives at all. It's power politics.
It's Putin's only interest is to stay in power. And he saw, and by the way, rightly so, Maidan as an imminent threat to his power in Russia. Because Ukrainians are so close to Russians. So it's 2 nations that were close, in history. So and by the way, very important to remember that Kyiv is still very much Russian-speaking city. Most of the top Ukrainian talk shows, they run in Russian or mainly in Russian, because there are many Russian journalists who moved in. So and seeing Ukrainians, standing up against corrupt Yanukovych regime, Putin's puppet, and winning this battle, even sacrificing their lives, and it's like sending a powerful message across the border. And Putin realized that if Ukraine would succeed as a democratic state, which joined Europe and could become, sort of a stronghold of European values next door, that will encourage Russians to follow their path.
Wasn't Maidan possible in Moscow? Or is it still possible in Moscow? With these strong anti-protest laws?
There were two Maidans in Ukraine. The first one was, I mean, it was peaceful and almost bloodless. Second one, of course, had fights, you know, and many human lives were lost. But let's not forget that Ukrainian political system differed quite dramatically from Russian one from the very beginning. Yes, the nations were close, but in 1994, the first Ukrainian president, Kravchuk, lost elections. It's a huge, you know, psychological blow for people there because they could see a peaceful transition of power. In Russia, even under Yeltsin, the government never lost crucial elections. They could lose parliamentary elections, but in '96 it pushed, you know, hard to make sure Yeltsin wins. So Russia has not experienced yet a peaceful transition of power. Ukraine did, and for a president losing elections, or for, of course, losing parliamentary elections, became a norm. So this is, Ukrainians grew up in the atmosphere where, I mean, with the corruption and with all the problems, but still, supreme power was not a sacred cow. So this, and Ukraine never ceased to have an independent parliament that always had 30–40% of opposition members. In 2004, there was a major faction of opposition parties. In 2013, so 14, so there was still, you know, a huge chunk of members of the parliament who were on the opposite side. And of course, Ukraine never ceased to lose independent TV stations. By the way, again, first thing, you know, I mentioned restoring Soviet anthem. Second one, to kill live TV. Since Putin took over 2000, no more live TV in Russia. So just only 9 o'clock news, which is just, you know, Kremlin's mouthpiece. But so dictators know where the danger comes from. So Maidan in its classical Ukrainian form, you may call classical because now the word Maidan is international. So it's being part of Russian language or any other language. It's a form of the protest which is based on different opposition groups, including those in the parliament or even in the government and in media. So Maidan is a product of soft authoritarian rule. Russia today is a full-blown one-man dictatorship. You know, you know, Maidan in Russia would be 1 million people storming Kremlin. Unfortunately, we already passed the moment where we could have a peaceful transition through the mass street protest. Maybe, but again, I don't want to to get into this debate now. Maybe in December 2011, maybe we had the chance. But let's not forget that even at that time, Russia did not have these components like, you know, truly independent opposition in the parliament and free TV that could cover the protests on the Moscow streets.
But after Putin's return to power in May 2012...
Let's be correct, return to Kremlin.
Oh, return to Kremlin, yes, of course.
Yes.
He always
was in power all the time, so even behind the curtain.
He crushed the independent media. He crushed actually...
what was left of independent media? So.
TV Dost, but it's only on internet and you've got to pay for it.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's Putin's views of the opposition were shaped by events he saw. Arab Spring. What's happened to Gaddafi? I'm sure you know his nightmares are connected to this, the final moments of Gaddafi's life. Yeah.
The protesters in Moscow were shouting, Putin, this will be your end too.
Exactly. So, and also he saw probably 120,000 in the streets of Moscow on December 24, the peak. Maybe even more on February 4, you know, but it was already big enough, not, you know, powerful enough to storm Kremlin and just to force, you know, police to change sides, but he saw it. So, and he decided that, you know, again, it's KGB reaction, you know, you have to, you know, crack down the opposition. So there are two options, you know. One is you start mass repressions like Stalin, but Putin's regime is not in a position to do it. It's a different...
It's a modern dictatorship.
It's a modern dictatorship. And
you can leave
there are
if you
much
want.
more sophisticated methods. First, you go after leaders of the protest, and then you also grab, you know, bystanders, those who were there accidentally. Also to send a message that anybody could be there. So you mix this kind of, you know, of attacks against protesters, and I mean, you send a very chilling message. But after what's happened with my dear friend and colleague, great Boris Nemtsov, last February was gunned down in front of Kremlin, that's a chilling message that you no longer can criticize Putin openly in Russia, even if you are former first deputy prime minister of Russia, and as many believed at one point, even Yeltsin's successor.
Because it was a rule inside the power elite never to kill a former member of your bunch.
It was not an ordinary member of the elite. Again, it was one of the top bureaucrats of Yeltsin's Russia, and shooting him, especially in front of Kremlin. So it was a demonstration that Russia reached a point where, capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, dictator, can no longer be criticized openly. That was Boris did, without listening to all the advices, that he would rather do it, from outside of Russia, because we were already reaching the point where elimination of this powerful critical regime was already very much in the Putin's agenda.
And Putin said afterwards that Nemtsov was not very well known inside Russia.
No, it's this,
So maybe, but we still don't know who's behind it. We'll probably never know.
The problem about Mr. Putin's comments about whether Boris was well known or not, or about any other members of opposition, I mean, it's very difficult to measure, because he never participated in a single debate in his life. This is the only debates that we could have in Putin's Russia is a debate with riot police on the streets, and it was always one-sided. So actually, the only experience of elections for Putin, it was 1996 when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. And Sobchak, who was a huge favorite in these elections, he let Putin run his campaign. Sobchak lost elections. And I think Putin realized that elections could be unpredictable. And as a KGB officer, he doesn't like unpredictability. So he worked very hard to make sure it will never happen again. So yes, it's this, when being asked repeatedly about my chess experience vis-a-vis what people mistakenly call Russian politics, whether my experience could help me, I always responded that it was absolutely useless, since in chess we have fixed rules and unpredictable results. In Putin's Russia is exactly the opposite.
Who actually, in your book, you write continuous about it, there is a very small group which actually rules the country. It's not a government, a huge government with tens of ministers. Actually, it are 4 or 5 persons.
More, maybe you definitely, you can look at the Forbes list.
Yes.
So that's this. And mysteriously you can discover many Putin's friends, that nobody ever heard of these people, 20 years ago. Now they're all billionaires. Moreover, their sons and daughters are billionaires. So this is, you have a kind of new aristocracy in Russia that, just basically inheriting all these positions. You look at the top, companies like Gazprom, Rosneft, and you discover, the relatives of Putin's entourage sitting here and there. So it's...
But the real decision makers, Bortnikov, Patrushev, Ivanov.
No, I think it's just, we reached a point where there's no even an inner circle making decisions. The decisions made by one man. It's a full-blown one-man dictatorship. Putin reached a state, where, we could say Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong. So I'm the country, okay, I'm the state. So this is the Louis XIV. So he doesn't see countries separate from his own interest. He can be influenced by these groups, but he's now like a spine, that it's built, in the center of the system, and everybody's trying to to find, checks and balances around him. So that's why it's all about one-man decisions. Naturally, they have the interest of protecting this rule, but still, we have to see the difference, because not all of them believe that they burn all the bridges. Putin has burned all the bridges, and they know that. So the question is, at what point Putin could look weak enough for some of them to challenge him. The problem is that Putin knows that. That's why he always creates, an image of an all-powerful geopolitical player. It's very important, because the real power comes from, from abroad. So it's like, you have to suck energy from most powerful countries in the world to look stronger and bigger. So for Putin, the main counterpart, of course, is Obama. So it's typical what he did after the Turkish Air Force shot down Russian bomber. Actually, it's amazingly that Russian press pitifully called it defenseless bomber. Yeah, defenseless bomber. So Putin didn't talk to Erdogan. he talked to Obama. Because for Russian television, it's very important. He doesn't talk to subordinates, he talks to the big boss. And I have to give him credit for staging a phenomenal event in New York at the end of September when he went to the United States to participate in the General Assembly of the United Nations. He was invited to also deliver a speech there. And Wall Street Journal asked me to write an editorial. I suggested I could do it before he spoke. Because I said I could tell you what will be said there, because it's irrelevant. At the end of the day, Putin's trip to New York was not about delivering a speech, was not about even discussing something with Obama. It was all about the picture. And he did it extremely well. You remember the moment, yes, Putin, shaking Obama the hand reluctantly. I bet you he spent hours in front of the mirror practicing. It's very important, because the picture on Russian television, Putin had to go to New York because the General Assembly, United Nations, he's invited, he has to speak. Putin goes to the belly of the beast. He has to meet Obama, the President of the United States. Okay, it's politeness. He has to shake his hand. And the next day, Russian planes bombed American-backed opposition in Syria. Who is more powerful? This is a PR stance that Putin is so good at. And unfortunately, the Western leaders, they don't understand. By playing in his hands, they are making him stronger, since no one in Russia, whether you have some generals or some oligarchs who are just very uncomfortable with Putin's rule, they could see he's a sociopath, who's just bringing country down. But no one will ever challenge a man who is so lucky, so powerful, and looks indispensable for the world politics.
Mm-hmm. But actually, the war in eastern Ukraine failed.
Yes.
Because there were several other plans, maybe to conquer half of the country.
Why it failed? Because Putin expected, he said, they probably believed his own propaganda, that ethnic Russians in Ukraine would join Putin's invading armies and will, proclaim in Novorossiya and New Russia from Lugansk to Odessa. Contrary to his expectations, majority, I would say, even a lion's share of ethnic Russians in these regions, they joined the Ukrainian army, fighting Putin's invading force. And he just realized that the further advance in Ukraine could be too costly, because it could remind Afghanistan, body bags. So he looked for a new angle to create problems. But I can bet you, he's not done with Ukraine. He will come back, because his goal is and will be to topple the pro-European Ukrainian government.
So, failure in Ukraine. The economy was already bad before the Ukrainian war. It's deteriorating.
Yes.
Second huge problem for him. Inside the Kremlin, he's got enemies. A palace revolution is always possible in that world. So, what's his...
Not in that world.
In that world. Well, but what is his way out? Will he become more narrow-minded?
There's no way out. And he knows it. There's no way out. He can create problems, hoping that, he'll survive while others go. That's why I said, stoking conflicts and chaos is his only, if you may call, logical policy. Because you said, the economy is in terrible shape. Oil is under $40 a barrel. He will probably run out of money in the next couple of years. So it's the different scenarios, but it's just he's definitely, running out of money. But when somebody is short in funds, whether we're talking about a family or a corporation or a country, you should look at what he or she does with the budget, because it gives you an indication about the plans. So what Putin does with the budget, when the first time he doesn't have a luxury of spending money for everything. He cannot throw them right, left, and the center. What are the three items in Putin's budget that are safe from any cuts, and moreover, we could see money being poured into these areas? Military, security apparatus, and propaganda. While cutting on everything, education, culture, healthcare, this is housing. So this is a war budget. So and this is a conscious plan of Vladimir Putin. And you could hear Russian Minister of Finance saying, 2 more years and we will have no other, we have only 2 tough choices to make. One is raise taxes. Second is to cut expenses, social and expenses, healthcare. He didn't even mention military, which is what is now is the biggest growing expense in Russian budget, because everybody knows, as long as Putin stays in power, military, security, and propaganda are untouchable.
Mm-hmm. But does it mean that it's seriously possible that there will be a war in Europe? You told us that there's already a war in Ukraine, which is Europe.
No, it is Europe, and again, Holland. Holland already paid. It's a huge price for not even paying attention and just ignoring the potential dangers.
An escalation.
Exactly, escalation. Putin's response to economic crisis in Russia will be always escalation. Mm-hmm. Now, at one point, when say oil price goes to 25 or 20, and Russian economy is bankrupt, I can bet you he'll find a way to cross Estonian or Latvian border. He will. He doesn't care. Again,
he plays poker that NATO won't interfere.
I'm sure there will be a lot of people here saying that maybe we have to compromise because it's a business. Of course, there's business, and of course, there's so many people that are just looking for finding just not a common ground, but common values with Putin. And also, don't forget, so far Putin's aggressive acts in Syria, as I mentioned, they already created a major crisis in Europe, and he could see the consequences. More refugees in Europe, more power to the ultra-nationalist groups. And if nothing happens, and you have more refugees, and you will see their ratings going up, so how many percentage you need for Marine Le Pen actually to become a formidable presidential candidate?
So his goal in Syria is to create more chaos.
But exactly, chaos. And if you do nothing, then you have Libya. There's total chaos there, and and the methods of creating conflicts and sending refugees to Europe, causing damage to European institutions and helping the ultra-nationalist groups can work. And then if you have ultra-nationalists calling shots or at least having influence in Europe, they're all in bed with Putin. Some of them are, like Marine Le Pen, are bragging about receiving credits from Russian-controlled banks. So, and they all have the same interest of dismantling European institutions for different reasons. But Putin is quite good in being an opportunist and grabbing an opportunity when he sees one.
𝐊𝐚𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐴 Khodorkovsky, the former oligarch living now in exile, last week he said that revolution is necessary and inevitable in Russia. 2 days later he received a summons from the Moscow prosecutor who charged him with 2 murders and several attempted murders.
What a surprise.
What a surprise.
What a surprise.
Do you agree with Khodorkovsky, who is supporting the opposition or the remains of opposition in Russia, that a revolution is necessary and inevitable?
No, because I don't like the word necessary, because this was my for last few years we always debated with Boris Nemtsov, who kept saying that Russia would not survive one more revolution, so we had to do everything to keep this protest non-violent, and we did. We had no violence from outside. There was not a single broken window during our demonstrations. The only violence streets came from police. My response to him was, Boris, I agree with your philosophy. The revolution in Russia would not lead to democracy next day. It would lead to chaos and turmoil. But the problem is that we are no longer calling the shots. We are no longer able to stop it, because what regime has been doing is steadily destroying democratic institutions and building this fascist-like dictatorship with all the powers in the hands of one paranoid man will create conflict that could not be resolved in any other way but uprising in the streets. So I think eventually Khodorkovsky agreed with my concerns, because this is not even forecast. It's more like a concern, because I don't want to see the revolution there, because I do understand that the end of Putin's regime will not lead to democracy. And I also, when I saw people in the free world being so surprised by Libya, and other Arab countries after Arab Spring ended up in a turmoil, my reaction was that do you expect countries after 20, 30, 40 years of a dictatorship to move into democracy overnight if dictator is overthrown? Because dictator stays in power. You may call him successful, because he succeeded in eliminating the opposition, all the layers of opposition. You can think that, he creates a desert, a political desert. And the longer he stays in power, the drier the desert is. Now, what kind of creatures can survive in a dry desert? So snakes, rats, scorpions. So that's why revolution offers you a chance. You may blow it up, you can grab it so things could be different, but there's no way, you can just move on, with democratic process. And I'm just, terrified to hear these Western powers discussing elections in Syria. I mean, God's sake, elections. So it's Syria. The state doesn't exist anymore. So you have sectarian wars that are older than most of European states. Yeah, so we just have to understand there's certain realities. And I'm not trying to be a naive, idealist, saying, oh, we do this and that and that. But all I know from history, by looking at these dictatorships and the end of these brutal regimes, that the longer we wait to oppose them, the higher the price we pay. 2 years ago, confronting Assad in Syria was difficult, but today the same measures will be unbearable. So basically, at every spiral, every layer of conflict, you will have to come back with more force, more sacrifices. So that's why if something happens with Putin today, I'm not telling you tomorrow we'll have, a great democracy. We still have to go through a very violent transition. He stays in power 1, 2, 3 more years, the outcome will be the same. He's not going to die quietly in his bed. Again, or maybe it will be quietly in his bed, but it's just
in the West, many people,
way before his expectations.
In the West, many people say Russia is not ready for democracy. The population is too servile, too much dependent or too much looking up to the people in power. Do you agree with that point of view? So that's also a reason to accept a regime like Putin's.
I'm always, annoyed to hear the stories about genetic determination. So these nations are ready and these nations are not. So we have enough, examples in the world history, modern history, to refute this notion. So if you look at the map of Korean Peninsula and you look at the North, you can come to the conclusion that the Koreans, they are born to be slaves and they deserve their, the 3 generations of brutal dictators. Unless you are aware there is South Korea, with the same Koreans, brothers and sisters, not even cousins, who built probably one of the most vibrant economies in the world and stable democracy. You go a little bit, offside there, you look at China, which everybody's trumpeting, China, continental China. I mean, it's so successful. But how about a tiny piece of China called Taiwan? Same Chinese, but it was a market economy. Now it's also stable democracy. And you could see that, the very same people, given a chance, could build a very, very different arrangements. You also have, this. Let's go back to Russia and Ukraine. So it's between Russia and Ukraine in the Soviet Union. There was no border. There were administrative borders. Even after 1991, the borders in eastern part of Ukraine, so western part of Russia, they were very nominal. So people can go back and forth. So we just, even with domestic passports, so they didn't have any visas, of course. So you have Belgorod on one side, on the Russian side, and Kharkiv on the Ukrainian side. So about 200 kilometers between these two cities. So same people, all of them ethnic Russians. All of them had the same contacts. All of them, many of them probably relatives. But the young boys from Belgorod, they are part of Putin's invading army, and they are contemporaries from the other side of the border, join Ukrainian army to defend their country. So it's not elementary to all these people, they are just doomed to live under dictatorship. I think it's about conditions. It's about and it's also about those who are in power. So you're still talking about a relatively small minority of people who could influence the events. And I think that we have enough talent in the country. It's whether it's in the country or outside. There's so many Russians now living outside. Many of our young Russians were educated in the free world. They run businesses in the free world. So I think that Russia will have hundreds of thousands of talented individuals relatively young individuals. And I would like to see more of 30, 40 years old people, just calling the or ruling the show. So and making sure that we can restore the true greatness of our country.
Thank you very much. So there's still hope left. The hope which existed in the beginning of the 90s.
I'm an uncured optimist by nature, so it's
okay.
And he says I have to compensate for my dark forecasts.
Okay, thank you very much.